The boarding doors were scheduled to close in 12 minutes. Flight 908 to Dubai hummed with the low, steady vibration of a fully powered aircraft waiting for clearance. First-class passengers were already sipping sparkling water beneath soft gold cabin lights. Business travelers scrolled through emails. A mother in 3A adjusted her silk scarf and glanced impatiently toward the aisle. Then he boarded last, tall, calm, wearing a charcoal hoodie, dark jeans, and carrying a black backpack slung over one shoulder. No rolling suitcase, no polished briefcase, no visible status symbols, just quiet confidence. He stepped into the cabin and offered a polite nod to the flight attendant at the door. "Evening," he said. She hesitated. "Evening," she replied, but her eyes scanned him longer than necessary. He walked down the aisle, row 1, row 2, row 3. He did not stop. Passengers began noticing. A man in 2C leaned toward his wife. He passed first class. A woman across the aisle frowned. Maybe he is looking for his seat. But he kept walking. Toward the cockpit. The subtle shift in the cabin atmosphere was almost physical. The air tightened. A businessman near the aisle straightened in his seat. "Excuse me," he said sharply. "That is the cockpit." The man in the hoodie continued forward calmly. A younger passenger lifted his phone camera, already recording. "Sir," the flight attendant called out, moving quickly down the aisle. "Can I see your boarding pass?" The man stopped just outside the cockpit door. He turned slowly. "Of course," he said evenly. But before he could reach into his pocket, another passenger stood up. "Why is he going up there?" the man demanded loudly. "That is restricted." A murmur rippled across the cabin. "Is that not a security issue? Why was he not stopped at the door?" The flight attendant's smile had vanished now. "Sir, I need you to step back into the cabin," she said, voice firm. The man held her gaze. Calm, unshaken. "I am exactly where I need to be." That sentence ignited something. A woman gasped. A man from 4B moved into the aisle, partially blocking him. "You cannot just walk into the cockpit." Someone whispered, "Call security." The phone camera tilted upward, zooming in. The man in the hoodie did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply stood there. Then the cockpit door clicked. It opened halfway. Captain Reynolds stepped out, his uniform crisp, 4 silver stripes gleaming under cabin lights. He looked directly at the man in the hoodie. "There you are," the captain said. Then he turned to the surrounding passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen, please allow our first officer through." Silence. Not confusion. Silence. The man in the hoodie stepped forward slightly. The businessman who had blocked him froze. The woman who gasped slowly lowered her hand. The phone recording wobbled. The captain placed a firm hand on the young man's shoulder. "First Officer Daniel Brooks will be co-piloting tonight's flight." The words hung heavy in the air. The cabin shifted from suspicion to embarrassment in seconds. Daniel adjusted the strap of his backpack. His expression never changed. The flight attendant stepped back immediately. "I am so sorry, sir." Daniel nodded politely. "Safety is important," he replied. The businessman who had blocked him cleared his throat. "We just did not know." Daniel met his eyes. "You assumed?" No anger, no sarcasm, just truth. Captain Reynolds glanced at the surrounding passengers. "We appreciate your concern for security," he said evenly. "But please remember, authority does not always announce itself loudly." He stepped aside. Daniel walked into the cockpit. The door closed, and the cabin erupted into awkward whispers. He was just. He did not look like. No one finished their sentences, because finishing them would mean saying what they had actually thought. Minutes later, the aircraft pushed back from the gate. As engines roared and the plane lifted into the night sky, Daniel's voice came over the intercom for the first time. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. This is your first officer, Daniel Brooks, speaking. We will be cruising at 38,000 feet tonight with smooth weather across the Atlantic." His voice was steady, professional, assured. The same voice they had questioned minutes earlier. A woman in 2A shifted uncomfortably. The man who blocked him avoided eye contact with anyone. The phone that had been recording was quietly placed face down. Mid-flight turbulence struck unexpectedly, not violent, but sharp enough to rattle glasses and tighten nerves. A sudden drop, gasps filled the cabin. The seatbelt sign flashed on. The plane steadied, then dipped again, this time harder. Passengers gripped armrests. Someone whispered a prayer. A child began to cry. Through it all, the cockpit remained composed. Daniel's hands moved with precision across controls. Captain Reynolds monitored calmly. "Crosswinds stronger than expected," the captain muttered. Daniel nodded, adjusting altitude. Another jolt. The cabin lights flickered briefly. and in that moment the passengers who had doubted him felt something deeper than embarrassment. They felt dependence, because now the man they had suspected was responsible for keeping them alive. Daniel's voice returned over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we are navigating a pocket of unstable air. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. We have everything under control." The turbulence eased gradually, then stopped. The aircraft leveled smoothly. A collective exhale filled the cabin. Captain Reynolds glanced sideways at Daniel. "Nice correction." Daniel gave a small nod. "Just doing my job." Hours later, as the plane began its descent into Dubai, the atmosphere had transformed. Passengers were quieter, reflective. When the wheels touched the runway and the aircraft rolled safely to the gate, spontaneous applause filled the cabin. As the seatbelt sign turned off, passengers began gathering their belongings. Captain Reynolds opened the cockpit door. Daniel stepped out first. This time no one blocked his path. Instead, eyes followed him differently. A woman from 2A stood hesitantly. "First Officer Brooks," she said softly, "I owe you an apology." Daniel paused. For what, he asked gently. For assuming, she admitted. He studied her expression. "Assumptions are quick," he replied. "Understanding takes effort." The businessman who had stepped into the aisle approached next. "I thought I was protecting everyone," he said awkwardly. Daniel nodded. "Intent does not erase impact." The man swallowed. "You flew that plane through turbulence like it was nothing." Daniel allowed a faint smile. "It was not nothing," he said. "It was training experience, discipline." The phone recording passenger stepped forward quietly. "I posted the video," he admitted. "But I am deleting it." Daniel tilted his head slightly. "Keep it," he said. The young man looked surprised. "Why?" "Because the beginning matters as much as the end," Daniel replied. "People should see how quickly fear can distort perception." The passenger nodded slowly. As the cabin emptied, a little boy tugged at his mother's sleeve. "Mom," he whispered loudly enough for Daniel to hear, "he is a pilot." "Yes," she said softly. Daniel crouched slightly to meet the child's eyes. "Maybe you will be too one day." The boy grinned. "Even if I wear hoodies," Daniel chuckled. "Especially if you wear hoodies." The mother smiled, but there was something else in her expression. Awareness. After passengers deplaned, Daniel stood briefly in the quiet cabin. Captain Reynolds approached. "You handled that well," the captain said. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I am used to it." The captain frowned slightly. "That does not make it acceptable." "No," Daniel agreed, "but it makes it predictable." He looked down the empty aisle where suspicion had once filled the space. At 38,000 feet, Daniel continued, "Trust is everything." Captain Reynolds nodded. "And trust," Daniel added quietly, "should not depend on appearance." The captain extended his hand. "You have earned every stripe you do not wear on that hoodie." Daniel laughed softly. "Maybe I will keep the hoodie." Later that evening, the video circulating online showed two very different moments. The first clip captured tense voices questioning him near the cockpit. The second clip showed the captain announcing his title. Millions watched. Comments poured in. Some defended their initial fear. Others admitted discomfort at recognizing themselves in those reactions. Daniel refused interviews. He released only one written statement: "Security awareness is necessary. Bias is optional." There is a difference between caution and assumption. Learn it. Within days, aviation forums began discussing unconscious profiling in airports and aircraft cabins. Training protocols were reviewed. Crew members across multiple airlines shared personal experiences. And somewhere in a small apartment across the country, a young black teenager watched the video repeatedly. He saw the suspicion. He saw the reveal. But most importantly, he saw the cockpit. Weeks later, Daniel boarded another flight in casual clothes. Again, last aboard, again backpack over one shoulder. Passengers glanced at him, but this time something was different. A woman in first class smiled politely, instead of staring. A businessman returned to his laptop instead of blocking the aisle. And when Daniel walked toward the cockpit, no one stood up. No one gasped. No one whispered. He entered without interruption. The door closed behind him. As the plane climbed into the sky, Daniel's voice filled the cabin once more. Calm, steady, capable. And somewhere in the cabin, someone who had once assumed differently listened more carefully now, because the lesson was no longer about one flight. It was about perception. About how quickly fear dresses itself as responsibility. About how easily confidence is mistaken for threat when it wears the wrong skin. And as the aircraft leveled above the clouds, Daniel adjusted the controls with quiet focus, not to prove anything, not to silence doubt, but simply to fly. Because sometimes the most powerful response to prejudice is not anger. It is excellence. And excellence speaks loudest when the engines are roaring and everyone on board depends on the very person they almost refuse to trust. But the story did not end in that cockpit. Weeks later, Daniel was invited to speak at a National Aviation Academy. He stood in front of a room filled with cadets in crisp uniforms and hopeful eyes. He wore the same hoodie, not as a statement, but as a reminder. They asked him what it felt like in that moment outside the cockpit. He paused before answering. It felt familiar, he said. The room grew still. Then he added something that stayed with them long after the session ended. Your uniform will give you authority. Your skill will earn you respect. But your character will define how you respond when both are questioned. A young cadet raised her hand. How do you stay calm when people doubt you? Daniel smiled gently. You remember why you started flying in the first place. Not to impress passengers, not to silence critics, but to rise above the clouds. Silence filled the room again. Not uncomfortable silence, inspired silence. And somewhere in the back row, the same teenager who once watched the viral video sat taking notes. Because sometimes representation is not about applause, it is about possibility. And Daniel Brooks continued to fly.